My friends, I have time and time again in my videos talked about Russia and its history, giving sneak peeks here and there, but why not cover the entire Russian history for you? This is what we're doing in this video. To understand how modern Russia was formed and how we arrived at today's circumstances, we need to take a brief excursion into Russian history and examine the influences on its state structure. The origins of the Russian Empire can be traced back roughly 1,000 years, to the time of the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire. Russia's history is complex and eventful, but I will highlight key facts that serve as the foundation for understanding the contemporary nation. My name is Artur Rehi and I am an Estonian military blogger, reserve soldier, and today we'll take a look at the entire Russian history. Let's go, my friends. Before the arrival of the Rurik dynasty in the 9th century, the future Russian lands were inhabited by East Slavic tribes. This region was part of the diverse cultural and economic network influenced by neighboring peoples. The Slavic tribes already had their own social and economic organization, but no centralized state like Kievan Rus existed yet. The East Slavs lived in groups that later became known as tribal unions. Each union occupied its own territory, had its own governance. Among the major tribes were Polans, Kriviches, Drevlians and Severians. These tribes were led by chiefs who ruled with the help of a military elite known as druzhina. The power of the princes was often decentralized and based on personal ties. Slavic society was predominantly patriarchal, with elements of collective self-governance at the community level. Their economy relied on agriculture, hunting, fishing, and livestock breeding. The Slavs traded actively with neighbors, including Byzantium, the Khazar Khaganate, and Finno-Ugric peoples, like the Finnish nowadays and Estonians. I am a Finno-Ugric person. The primary trade route, known as from the Varangians to the Greeks, connecting the Baltic and Black Seas, was already a vital artery. Ancient Rus developed along this route. The Byzantines referred to the Varangians, Vikings, as the Rus, a name that later became associated with the state. Before the Rurik dynasty, the East Slavs had developed social structures and external connections, but remained fragmented. The creation of a centralized state was a significant step in strengthening internal unity and enhancing the region's international standing. This unification was far from peaceful. Establishing a control over trade routes in the 8th and 9th centuries involved frequent Viking raids, clashes with nomadic tribes, and conflicts among local groups. By the end of the 9th century, the Vikings had secured control over key rivers such as the Neva, Lovat and Dnieper. Constant intertribal conflicts hindered stable political structures, while nomadic raids and the need to protect trade routes necessitated military organization. To ensure security from constant attacks and internal strife, the Slavic tribes decided to create a centralized state to serve as a foundation and guarantee of stability. This state formed around two crucial trade centers along the Varangian to Greek route, Novgorod and Kiev. By the way, Novi in Russian means new, Gorod means city, so Novgorod is new city. And Kiev, when you want to say it like the Ukrainians, you gotta say Kyiv. But in Estonia, we sometimes still say Kiev, so I apologize for that. According to one popular version presented in the primary chronicle, in 862, the Slavic tribes invited the Varangian Rurik and his brothers, Sinies and Truvor, to establish order and governance. This event is known as Calling of the Varangians. However, the story of Rurik's invitation and the unification of the East Slavic tribes, as recounted in the primary chronicle, should not be regarded as a precise historical account. Instead, it represents an attempt to explain and justify the origins of Rus using mythological and political concepts relevant to the 12th century, when the chronicle was written. The actual historical process was likely more complex, involving a gradual state formation influenced by internal conflicts among Slavic tribes and external forces such as the Varangians, Khazars and the Byzantium. In the 9th century, Scandinavian Vikings or Varangians began penetrating Eastern Europe. They likely played a significant role in establishing early political structures, not as conquerors, but as allies, trade partners, or temporary rulers. Acting as merchants and warriors, the Varangians often served as intermediaries between Slavic tribes and external powers like Byzantium and the Khazar Khaganate. The invitation of Rurik to Novgorod and the establishment of centralized rule can be interpreted as diplomatic compromise and political agreement among various Slavic tribes, rather than a military conquest. A brief video cannot encompass all the conflicts, rulers, imperial conquest, losses and treaties involving Byzantium during that era, but it is important to highlight their influence on Rus. One significant figure is Oleg. Russians would say Oleg right now, but I'm gonna say Oleg, sounds cooler. One of the most renowned and influential rulers of Kievan Rus. He played a crucial role in uniting the East Slavic lands and expanding their territories. After Rurik's death, 879, Oleg served as a regent for Rurik's young son, Igor. He assumed control over both Novgorod and Kyiv, a key trade and strategic center. In 882, Oleg captured Kyiv, eliminating the local rulers and made it the capital of the unified Kievan Rus state. In 907, he led a successful campaign against Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire's capital. With a combined army of Varangians and Slavs, Oleg laid siege to the city. The campaign concluded with a peace treaty that granted trade privileges and free access to Byzantine markets for Rus merchants, securing diplomatic and economic ties between the two powers. This agreement marked a major milestone in the early development of Kievan Rus as a significant political entity. As a result of the peace treaty with Byzantium, Kievan Rus began to enter the Christian cultural sphere. In 988, Prince Vladimir, I think it means ruler of the world. Way to go, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir the Great baptized Rus according to the Byzantine rite, making Byzantium the principal spiritual and cultural influence for the region. Thing is, he was the first baptizer of the entire Rus people, meaning all of the religious text and written text started to arrive from Byzantium. This marked the Byzantium-Rome's culture flowing to the Russian lands. The language and the writing system of the Rus also developed with the help of Byzantium. In 863, two Byzantine missionaries, Kirill and Methodius, created the first Slavic alphabet. Their mission was closely linked to the Christianization of the Slavic peoples who had previously been pagans. The alphabet was needed to translate the Bible and liturgical text into the language understandable to the people. There are two alphabet versions associated with their names: Glagolitic, considered to be the first alphabet they created, and Cyrillic, the later system that evolved into the modern Slavic alphabets. The Cyrillic alphabet was created using the Greek alphabet, with additional letters to represent sounds absent in Greek. This system became the foundation of the written language in Kievan Rus. By the way, in Cyrillica, which is like the Slavic alphabet right now, Ukrainian looks magnificent, everything is really good. But then we have the Polish, who have Slavic language, but they're using the Latin alphabet. Oh my God! I mean, I'm glad they do. It's part of the Western culture, but it's impossible to read Polish words because it's z, ż, sza, sz.
Name und Vorname?
Grzegorz Brzęczyszczykiewicz. Brzęczyszczykiewicz.
Those sounds in the Latin alphabet, they don't make sense. Go and look up written Polish language nowadays. It's damn crazy difficult. Trade with Byzantium had a profound impact on the state structure, culture and religion of Rus. Modern Russia often refers to itself as the Third Rome. What was Byzantium like in the 9th or 10th centuries? Formed from the empire remnants of the Roman Empire, Byzantium, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, was flourishing in the 9th century, after years of turmoil and decline. Constantinople, the capital, was the wealthiest city in the region, as it was a cultural and trade hub where the West and East met. Among the most important goods traded besides spices, jewels and silk were slaves. Even before the formation of Kievan Rus, the constantly warring Slavs and nomads provided an important source of slaves. During raids, tribes captured prisoners and sold them to the Varangians, who then transported the slaves to the markets in Constantinople. Eastern Slavs, such as the Kriviches, Slovenes and Radimiches, often became slaves as the result of raids of conflicts between tribes. In some cases, members of Finno-Ugric peoples, like the Merians and the Veps, could also be enslaved. God damn it, not the Finno-Ugrics! The Varangians themselves also captured slaves during their raids. Slaves worked on imperial estates, in the holdings of secular and spiritual landowners, tenants and small landholders. Slavery was a significant part of the state system in Byzantium throughout the empire's existence. However, slavery did not play a central role in the economy of Kievan Rus. In Rus, the following terms were used to describe slaves and dependent people. Holop, the main category of slaves. Chiliats, originally referred to all domestic servants and later become synonymous with slaves. Ryadovichi, dependent people who served under contract. Zakupi, people who took out a loan and were obliged to work for their creditor until the debt was paid. Damn, imagine the zakupi nowadays. You gotta go to the bank, you gotta get a mortgage, you take it out, and then for the entire time, you gotta work for them 24 hours a day until your mortgage is paid. I wouldn't want to be a zakupi. Unlike ancient societies, where the economy was based on slave labor, in the Rus, the key role was played by free peasants. Smerd. A really cool word, I think. Smerd. You're a free peasant, but if I'm a smerd, nobody will mess with you. Unless they know what it means. Slaves, or holopi, were mainly used in the households of princes, boyars, and wealthy individuals. The influence of Kievan Rus on the slave system of Muscovy can be seen in the gradual transition from personal slavery to serfdom. The role of the slave trade diminished over time, and by the 12th century, the system was considered controversial. However, servitude in various forms persisted in Russia up until the present day. Yeah, I gotta say that again, because up until the present day. Many other characteristics of Byzantium, which Rus eventually inherited, include the system of corruption. A single video would not suffice to explain the entire history of Kievan Rus, how Kiev differed from Novgorod, and how Muscovy eventually diverged from Kiev, how rulers changed, and how the political structure evolved. The struggles for power, the rulers who displaced one another, and the changes in the state's framework are complex. However, the features of the feudal state that eventually formed in Russia can be seen in modern Russia as well. Many of the negative traits it inherited are from Byzantium. Byzantium was notorious for its extensive system of bribery. Officials often used their positions for personal gain, selling offices, collecting excessive taxes, or demanding payment for services. High-ranking positions were often bought, despite laws prohibiting such practices. This weakened administrative efficiency. Informing or denouncing was legalized, with informers receiving a share of the fines, which encouraged abuse. Various rulers attempted to combat corruption, and reforms were enacted at different stages of Byzantium's 1,000-year history, but corruption ultimately became one of the causes of the empire's fall. The gradual degradation of the bureaucracy and military due to the appointment of unqualified individuals weakened military power. Sound familiar? It's like that in Russia nowadays. The economic exhaustion of provinces from corrupt tax collection schemes led to the internal weakening of the entire system. These patterns closely resemble modern Russia, and the roots of these problems can be traced back to the history of Byzantium. Another characteristic of modern Russia that formed during the trade route period is the borrowing of cultures from other peoples. Before the unification into a state, various tribes had their own cultural features and traditions. Positioned at the crossroads of Western and Eastern cultures, Rus developed by borrowing and imitating other cultures. What we now call Russian culture is a mix of Eastern and Western influences, along with the strong influence of Finno-Ugric tribes. Yeah, the Finno-Ugrics. For example, the Russian kokoshnik is a headdress of the Finno-Ugric peoples. The balalaika is derived from the Ukrainian dombra, which itself came from the east. Similar instruments with the same construction and sound production methods still exist in the musical cultures of Eastern countries today. This cultural formation took place artificially much later. But before this, there was another historical event that strongly influenced the shaping of Russia. And that was the Inquisition. Nah, I'm kidding, it was the Mongols. The Mongols invaded. The Mongols' invasion and the formation of the Golden Horde were likely the most significant events that laid the foundation for the future of the Russian Empire. The Mongol Empire became its active conquest under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century. After his death in 1227, his heirs continued the expansion, creating the largest land empire in history. The first encounter between the Russians and the Mongols occurred in 1223 at the Battle of Galka River, where the combined forces of Russian princes and Cumans were defeated. However, after this victory, the Mongols temporarily retreated eastwards. In 1237, a Mongol army under the leadership of Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, invaded Russian lands. The Mongols besieged Ryazan, which was completely destroyed. In 1238, Vladimir and Moscow fell. Vladimir was the name of one of the Russian cities back then. The Principality of Vladimir suffered significant losses, and Prince Yuri Vsevolodovich was killed. In 1240, the Mongols captured Kiev, which was entirely destroyed, and its population slaughtered. It's already becoming repetitive. I mean, what's up with the Mongols? Do they know how to do anything else except slaughter entire populations? After the fall of Kiev, the Mongols moved further west, penetrating into Poland and Hungary. The conquered lands of the Rus incorporated into the Golden Horde, a state founded by Batu Khan in 1243. The horde spanned territories from the Volga with its capital at Sarai Batu, later Sarai Perke. Also, with the dates and the years I'm saying here, there's gonna be a test at the end of the video, so you better be writing them all down. Mongol rule in Rus lasted approximately 240 years. The yoke, or the Tatar yoke as the Russians call it now, signified political and economic subjugation to the Golden Horde. Russian princes were required to travel to the Horde to receive yarlik, an official decree to rule. The hordes were responsible for collecting tribute, which included money, goods, and human resources. Russian troops were often conscripted for the Mongol military campaigns. Moscow, due to its strategic location and the diplomatic skill of its princes in maintaining relations with the Horde, became the leading principality of Rus, and later formed the basis of the Russian Empire. So, because of the Mongols and their occupation of Russia, Moscow rose. The influence of the Golden Horde was immense. The Mongols were notorious for their cruelty, a trait that became deeply ingrained in the Russian culture and persists to this day. It is difficult to fully describe this situation in a way that would be approved by YouTube algorithms, but it is important to note that the Mongols brought with them traditions of torture and the complete annihilation of captured cities. Batu's army captured and ravaged 49 major and medium-sized settlements, of which 15 lost their city status and 14 were never restored. The methods used to suppress resistance were varied, sophisticated, and most importantly, unimaginably brutal. This is a critical topic, but one that is hard to present in videos without triggering content moderation issues. The Mongols used execution methods that even the inquisitors, who were infamous for their cruelty in medieval Western Europe, could not have conceived of. If you want to learn more about this, an internet search will provide further information. The key consequences of the Tatar yoke, beyond the inherited brutal cruelty, were political in nature. The Mongols' governance methods strengthened the power of the princes through their experience with Mongol administration, and the concentration of power in Moscow paved the way for the creation of a centralized state. The economic situation during the Mongol yoke worsened significantly. The devastation of lands led to demographic decline and a collapse of the economy. The obligation to pay tribute slowed economic development, and many regions fell into decay. Additionally, elements of administrative and military organization from the Golden Horde were adopted by the Rus. This influence extended to the taxation systems and punitive measures. Russian princes borrowed Mongol military tactics and the organization of armies, with all the ensuing consequences. It is incorrect to classify Russia today as part of Europe or Western culture. Much of what was previously associated with European identity was destroyed during the Mongol domination. Russia shares more in common with China than with the European Union, and this connection traces back to the Golden Horde, including the systems of strong centralized power, taxation, land control, and one of the most important legacies, imperialistic ambitions. Over time, the Golden Horde weakened. Moscow, exploiting the Horde's vulnerability and using the accumulated experience, became the center for uniting Russian lands. The liberation from Mongol rule in the 15th century marked the beginning of the rise of Moscow Kingdom and the expansion of its territory, ultimately leading to the creation of the Russian state. One of the central heroes of Russian history during this time is Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible. His governing methods, largely adopted from the Golden Horde, eventually became traditional in Russia. Ivan the Terrible was born on August 25, 1530, to Grand Prince Vasily III and Elena Glinskaya. His father passed away when Ivan was still an infant, making him the heir to the throne. Due to his youth, power during the early years of his reign was held by a regency under his mother. Ivan became the Grand Prince of Moscow in 1547 at the age of 16. Wow, that's a lot of responsibility for the age of 16. And that same year, he was crowned Tsar of all Rus, becoming the first Russian ruler to take this title. From the outset, Ivan IV sought to reform the system and concentrate all power in his hands, following the example of the Mongol Khans. His most significant innovation was the creation of the oblivon, a separate governing body and personal guard responsible for repression and the elimination of opposition. Ivan divided the country into two parts. One under the control of the oblivoniks, a special court tasked with the repression, and the other under the traditional boyar structures. From that time onward, different institutions in Russia have fulfilled the role of the oblivon under various rulers. But to this day, Russia's dictatorship relies on secret services whose task is to find internal enemies, suppress opposition, carry out mass purges, eliminate resistance to the government, and apply the hardest methods against them. In modern times, the FSB performs the role of the oblivon. Ivan IV's path to absolute power was obstructed by the church. He clashed with various religious and secular figures, particularly opposing the clergy's attempts to limit his authority. One of the most notable examples of the conflict was with Metropolitan Philip II, one of the most prominent opponents of the oblivon. Metropolitan Philip II, condemning the violence and repression Ivan the Terrible applied during the oblivon period, became one of the first high-ranking church figures to openly oppose his cruel policies. Despite his religious affiliation, Ivan the Terrible used the church for his political purposes, manipulating it to strengthen his power. When Philip condemned the Tsar's brutal actions, Ivan ordered the execution of the Metropolitan, who had become a threat to him. The church became not only a spiritual guide, but also an ideological control tool. Ivan the Terrible actively used church assemblies to gain spiritual approval for his decisions, while simultaneously seeking to strengthen his role as the chief defender of the Orthodox faith. These methods can be seen in modern parallels, where power also uses the church to legitimize its actions and manipulate public opinion. The reorganization of church authority, the creation of the Patriarchate, was part of Ivan the Terrible's strategy to enhance his political influence. Ivan strengthened the relationship with the church, making it more subordinate to the central power. His intervention in monastery affairs and the fight against heresies were also part of his strategy to eliminate potential threats to his power. His rule significantly influenced the future development of the state and the church. laying the foundation for a closer relationship between them in the future. The expansion of the territory of the Moscow state was another important aspect of Ivan IV's reign. The conquest of the Kazan and the Astrakhan Khanates, as well as the beginning of the expansion into Siberia, made Muscovy one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe. Participation in the Livonian War, though not bringing significant territorial gains in the long run, left a mark in history, including the tragic memory of the actions of the Oprichniki. The monarchs and empresses of Russia changed over time, but they all shared one common trait: absolute power, secret services, and the church as an instrument of political influence. Not all rulers, but many waged wars and expanded Russian territories into Siberia, Europe, and the Caucasus. The approach to occupied territories remained unchanged: repression of the local population, suppression of resistance, and exploitation of resources. All of this followed the tradition of the Golden Horde. Peter I was the first to introduce European traditions, but his methods cannot be considered progressive. He also captured territories along the Gulf of Finland, including Estonia. Damn it! Russians often say that he cut a window to Europe, but he had his own vision of Europe. Catherine II, despite supporting reforms in education, law and trade, employed repressive measures against any threat to her power. Her struggle against peasant uprising and potential revolutionary movements was ruthless. Nicholas I was one of the most famous monarchs who harshly suppressed any signs of liberalism. After the December uprising of 1825, when the group of officers, Decembrists, attempted to change the political system, Nicholas I began large-scale repressions. He imposed strict censorship, banned liberal and revolutionary movements, and created a system of spies and secret services to detect anti-state sentiments. During Alexander II's reign, a decree was issued allowing priests to break the secrecy of confession if someone expressed dangerous thoughts for the state during confession. This occurred in the context of fighting revolutionary sentiment and subversive political activities. This step became part of a broader campaign to suppress revolutionary and liberal ideas in the Russian Empire. Thus, even in the most intimate and sacred sphere, the confession, it became possible for the state to interfere. Under Alexander III, the so-called reaction began, a period in which censorship was tightened, political opponents and reformers were persecuted, and freedoms were restricted. Alexander III abolished many of his father's reforms, strengthened absolute monarchy, limited press freedoms, and suppressed workers' and students' protests. Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor, also fought against liberalism, especially amidst the growing revolutionary movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He made certain concessions in 1905 when, after the First Russian Revolution, he was forced to sign the Manifesto of Reform and grant certain rights, including the creation of the State Duma. However, Nicholas II quickly reversed the liberal reforms and continued to suppress opposition. Another unchanging aspect was servitude and slavery. Serfdom in Russia was a form of peasant dependence on landlords that existed from the 16th century until the mid-19th century. Peasants were essentially not free people. They were tied to the land they worked on and could not leave it without the owner's permission. This system gradually developed, beginning with the establishment of legal norms that restricted peasants' rights, and it was finally solidified in the 17th and 18th centuries. The relationship between the boyars, the landlords, and serfs remained ingrained into the mentality of the Russians up until the present day. There were serfs, subjugated people without rights, often subjected to harsh treatment, and there were boyars, who held unlimited power in the designated areas of responsibility and remained unpunished as long as they were loyal to the Tsar. We now come to the third event that shaped modern Russia, the revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks. This is the most significant event and deserves a separate video in the future, but I'll be brief for now. By 1917, Russia remained an archaic feudal state whose power relied on force and repression. Technologically, Russia was always lagging behind the West. The majority of the population were poor and uneducated peasants. Contributions to the intellectual resources of the country were always accompanied by rejection of new ideas and repression. In the 19th century, there were laws forbidding Jews from settling and living in Moscow. The history of anti-Semitism in Russia runs deep. The small nations of the empire also experienced harsh treatment and restrictions. The acceptance of new ideas was always a challenge. By this time, Siberia had prisons and exile camps for criminals and oppositionists, which would later form the basis of the GULAG system. By 1917, during industrialization, many peasants moved to the cities to work in factories and manufactories, but their lives remained hard and poor. The Bolsheviks took advantage of the poverty and illiteracy of the factory workers, promising power to the people. We will leave the story of revolution for future videos, but the outcome was the rise to power of a small group of people whose goal was not to liberate the people from the oppression of rulers, but to take the place of the powerful. The Bolsheviks did not emerge out of nowhere. The system in Russia itself gave birth to some of the most cruel, unscrupulous and insane people. World War I flooded the country with individuals who had endured the horrors of war. The oppressed of yesterday tasted blood, and the Bolsheviks used their sense of revenge to establish their dictatorship. Under the Bolsheviks, the modern-day Russia we know today was ultimately shaped, with its foundation lying in centuries-old traditions of cruelty. To protect the revolution and suppress opposition, the Bolsheviks created the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combining Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, or Cheka, which became essentially the first security service in the Soviet Russia. They were the 20th century oprishniki. The Cheka acted actively on the front lines, guarding the rear, arresting and destroying suspected enemies of the revolution. Members of the Cheka used their power primarily to settle personal scores and eliminate anyone they suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. There were no trials. Decisions for executions were made by a 3-member commission on the spot. And a denunciation from a neighbor was enough to convict. Blood flowed like a river. The complete collapse of the economy allowed them to manipulate people who were willing to do the most horrendous things for a piece of bread. The Red Army often included real criminals, and their lack of principles worked in favor of the Chekists. In 1919, a unified system of labor camps was established, which later formed the GULAG. The GULAG camps ultimately became the form of slavery in the USSR. Prisoners were used for construction, mineral extraction in Siberia, and manufacturing. With the money earned from the sale of the precious minerals and other resources, Stalin purchased American and European factories, which was later presented by Soviet propaganda as a miracle of the industrialization in the Soviet Union. In the agricultural sector, the Bolsheviks created collective farms or kolkhoz. Peasants assigned to the kolkhozes could not leave them. It was serfdom in 20th century Russia. I will go into more detail about the GULAG system in future videos, but it is important to note that the system was very similar to serfdom in Russia over the centuries. The directors of the GULAG camps were like landlords of the past and had complete power over their prisoners. Modern Russia still bears all of the characteristics of the past Russia. The leaders' unlimited power, corruption, a rigid vertical of power where officials are above the law as long as they remain loyal to the authority, secret services rooting out dissidents and carrying out mass repressions. Subjugated peasants whose lives are expendable, and most importantly, terrifying cruelty inherited from the Golden Horde and flourishing during the era of the GULAG. The system of relations between the boyars and their serfs has deeply embedded itself in the mentality of the Russian people. They don't know anything else, they haven't seen anything else, but they don't want anything else, because any liberal ideas are seen as a threat, considered betrayal and punished. The democratization of Russia is impossible because such ideas do not take root in Russian society. The constant attempts to expand the empire and conquer neighboring countries continue. These attempts will not stop as long as Russia exists in its current form. The Western world must understand that believing in the country's reform is futile. It will not happen. Russians only understand the language of power because their society has a rigid vertical hierarchy of power, where the one who is higher and stronger is right in the system. Relations with Russia need to be built on this understanding. There is no need to fear that someone will push the red button. That will never happen because Russians also fear the consequences. Russia will always test the West's resilience, seeing how far it can go by using force and blackmail. And as soon as it encounters a superior opponent, it retreats. They understand the law of the strong, and it is only this language of communication that needs to be used. My friends, this was a complete history of Russia gone through very quickly. I skipped hundreds of years like that because we gotta keep this video. I mean, it's long enough as it is. So if you stayed until now, you know all of the most important things there is to know about Russian history, and you know the Russian mindset. Thank you for watching. Thank you for trusting me with your time, and I will make many more videos like this for you. If you like my channel, best way to support is buy me a coffee. Link is in the description below. I'll be mentioning Buy Me a Coffee monthly members with my Estonian pronunciation, you know, Finno-Ugric pronunciation in every video. So go and sign up. Until my next video, my friends, be sure to be back, subscribe, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.